I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, who's had a career spanning over 20 years as an international human rights lawyer. He's worked in the George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump administrations. He's also a senior fellow at Pepperdine University, where he heads the Global Faith and Inclusive Societies program. And lastly, he is most recently the author of Ending Persecution, Charting the Path to Global Religious Freedom. So KnoxThames has literally written the book on international religious liberty. So if everyone could please welcome KnoxThames.
I was sitting in a church in Cairo, Egypt, off Tahrir Square, watching a grown man cry. It was February 2010, a few months before the Arab Spring would wash over that country and change so much and so little in the region. And we were there watching a man cry. It was my first visit to Egypt. I was part of a U.S. government delegation to visit that incredibly important country to understand the climate for religious freedom. We landed in the wee hours. Many of us had never visited. We actually got up early after a few hours of sleep to go see the great pyramids of Giza, those incredible wonders of the world. And then later that afternoon, we were watching a grown man cry. By the world standards, he was a person of no real importance. He did menial day jobs, but he had made a decision that had both changed his life for the better and for the worse. He'd become a Christian, and now he was being hunted by his government and his neighbors and family, and he didn't know what to do, and he sat there and cried. A few years later, in April 2017, I was visiting Pakistan in the giant city of Lahore, a city of 30 or 40 million people, in our beautiful American consulate there, and I was watching another grown man cry. This individual was from the Hazara Shia Muslim community, a group distinct to the border regions of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and ISIS hates them because they're the wrong kind of Muslim. And he shared about how his friends had been murdered by a suicide bomber, and he sat there and cried because he didn't know what to do. And so in a certain sense, these cases were both unique and yet incredibly common. Unique in that these were two individuals made in the image of God, and their stories matter to God, but also incredibly common because there's a pandemic of religious persecution sweeping the world that impacts people of all faiths and none in every corner of the world. And so what I'm going to share a bit about today as your last speaker, and I'll try to keep it interesting because you've finished the race almost. I'll be drawing from my book that was just introduced that looks at my 20 years of government service and asks questions about how can the United States continue to lead the world in advocating for religious freedom for everyone, but what can we do different to meet the challenge of global persecution so that we can have an answer to these gentlemen and the millions of other people like them who are suffering for what they believe. So today I'm going to talk about four topics. What is persecution? Just have a definitional ground floor. Talk about attempts to counter it that we focused on while I was in government and other efforts. Think a little bit about new ideas to implement, and talk about the need for continued effort. This is drawn from the book. Like I said, it was released just 2 months ago. I wrote it as a practitioner for a policymaker audience, an activist audience, but also for the classroom. I think this would be of interest to students and teachers because I talk about what it's like to represent the United States on these important issues, on these important value issues. But first, this idea of persecution and what it is. Like I said, there's a pandemic of persecution that's sweeping the world. The Pew Research Center reports that roughly 2 out of every 3 people on earth live in a country that restricts the free practice of faith. So think about that. 2 out of 3 people on earth live in a country that puts severe limitations on how people can pursue truth as their conscience leads. Now, a quick caveat, that doesn't mean everyone's being persecuted, but there are very narrow lanes of permissible religious activity, and if you decide to change lanes, question the lanes, lead the road altogether, you'll be prosecuted by your government, persecuted by your neighbors, and sometimes both. In addition, Pew reports that roughly 84% of the global community believes in God or a higher power. So the world is furiously religious, and while interest in things of faith are fading in Europe and North America, that is not the case around the world. And for the remaining 16%, there are still people that have a belief system. They may not fit into a specific box or maybe more agnostic or humanistic, but they also have beliefs that shape their world. So the world is an incredibly religious place where people are looking to something beyond themselves to give their life purpose, meaning, and direction. So we take these two trends, incredibly high levels of government restrictions and societal restrictions on faith practices, and incredibly high levels of people who are interested in faith. And this is a recipe for instability, human rights violations, and suffering on a massive scale. And I like to say that religious freedom will be the challenge of the 21st century because everybody is everywhere. I mean, people and groups are mixing together as really never before in human history. Groups you used to read about in an encyclopedia, or that would be me, you guys, on Wikipedia, you're now rubbing shoulders with in the grocery store, on the playground. And this can produce incredible synergies and new ideas and innovations. But we also know that living together in diversity is hard. There's a natural fear of people who look, believe, or pray differently than ourselves. And understanding how we can create a community where we respect the beliefs, respect the rights of people to hold different beliefs, and agree to disagree on these ultimate questions, and do so peacefully in a community. It's hard work, and so many countries are failing that test. And when we talk about persecution, I want to emphasize we need to use that word very carefully. I've been concerned about how, in some contexts, advocates, in an attempt to draw attention to their cause, which is worthy, will call anything persecution. But friends, persecution is violent. It's death, it's destruction, jailing, beatings, torture, rape. It's biblical kinds of persecution. And to honor those people who are truly suffering, to honor those two men who cried in front of me, we need to be careful about what we call persecution. There can be other things that are wrong. They can be discriminatory, hateful, intolerant, and we want to advocate against those too, but we need to reserve the word persecution for the most violent of situations. So in the book, I try to define what is persecution, because when you talk about it globally, it seems monolithic, it seems overwhelming. But from my experience, I saw at least 4 different typologies. And so if we're going to develop, like you would with medicine for a specific disease, we need to understand the specific types of persecution so we can formulate an effective response. So the first kind of persecution that I talk about in the book is authoritarian persecution. And this is where the mechanics and power of the state are brought to bear against religious believers to crush them, to jail them, to push them out of existence. And so I should add, by the way, with each chapter that focuses on a different type of persecution, I have a corresponding chapter that talks about and gives examples for things we tried to do when I was in government to counter them, what the good and the bad ideas that we grappled with. So with authoritarian persecution, I talk about what's happening in China against the Uyghur Muslim community and what's happening in Burma against the Rohingya Muslim community. As just the best example of the power of the state brought to bear against religious groups that they are afraid of or find undesirable. The second typology of persecution is extremism. This is where mobs are gathered by so-called community leaders to attack someone who said something they don't like, who believes something they're afraid of, to burn down their homes, to tear down their sanctuaries. And here, I spent a lot of time on Pakistan, a country I visited almost 10 times over my career, looking at the case of Asia Bibi, who a few years ago was probably the best-known prisoner of conscience in the world. She was sentenced to death for her fidelity to Christ. But also I talk about a distinct community called the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, which is persecuted by the Muslim majority. They have some different beliefs that are not quite orthodox, and the state goes after them with a vengeance. But also these mobs will be riled up to attack their churches, their communities, and their mosques. So that's the example of extremism. The third typology is democratic. This is where a majority community undermines minority protections to use the power of the ballot box to transform their beliefs into law. So here I look at India and Nepal. India is a massive, massive country, and Nepal is a small country by Asian standards, but it still has 30 million people, making it bigger than most European countries. and how politicians have campaigned on a platform of hate and discrimination, convinced voters to back them, and then have changed the laws to advance their theological agenda. And the last form is terrorism. This is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, where individuals are willing to murder to advance their ideology or their theology. I talk a lot about Iraq. That was a country I visited countless times as I joined the State Department in a special envoy role during the Obama administration, and then stayed on during the Trump administration, focusing on religious minorities in that region, telling stories about what we did to try to recreate the environment where religious minorities, Christians, Yazidis, and others felt like they had a future after terrorists had attempted a genocide. How do we pick up the pieces? My next point is this question of what do we do about it? Persecution is running rampant. What can we do? Well, I think there is some good news in this dark situation. First, we should be very thankful about we've got global standards through the United Nations, primarily the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, followed by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Both of them have an article, Article 18, that defines what religious freedom is, and it defines it expansively, the right to have any faith, no faith, change faith, meet together for worship, pray alone or with others, educate your children. We can be proud that as Americans, the Universal Declaration was overseen by Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady, and she led this incredibly diverse drafting committee in the early days of the United Nations, when they were meeting actually in San Francisco because the headquarters hadn't been built in New York yet. And so when I would engage governments and press them to let people out of jail or change their laws, they would say, this is just an American invention. I'd say, actually, it is a part of our story, but this is a UN standard that all countries have agreed to uphold. And so we have that yardstick to measure compliance and to aim to encourage countries to uphold. In addition, there are tools at the United Nations, United Nations is a complicated place, but there are some good tools that can be used. There's a special rapporteur, a special envoy on religious freedom that's been around for several decades, filled by different experts. There's something called the Universal Periodic Review. It's at the Dysfunctional Human Rights Council, but it's a good tool that can shine a light. There are statements and resolutions. But we should also be proud as Americans, we've been a global leader in advocating for religious freedom. Back in 1998, Congress passed almost unanimously, and Bill Clinton signed into law the International Religious Freedom Act, which declared that the protection and promotion of religious freedom shall be a foreign policy priority of the United States. It created a special ambassador and a special office at the State Department, mandated the writing of special reports, has a special sanctions system so we can actually put teeth to the concerns that we express, and no other country comes close to matching our commitment to advancing religious freedom for everybody everywhere. And that's, as someone who's worked in those systems for a couple of decades, I was always really proud that it was the United States that was leading the way on this core issue that's such an important part of our story and a reflection of our values. In addition, there are new networks forming, and there's a new alliance centered on religious freedom for everybody. There are NGO networks, non-governmental organization networks bringing together people of different faiths who can agree on the time of day theologically, but agree that every person has the right to pursue truth as their conscience leads. This is all great. It's not hyperbole to say never before in human history have governments and faith leaders come together to advocate for the religious freedoms of other peoples in other countries of other faiths. So this is a good news story. But the reality is this good news story isn't good enough. And so we have to continue to be thinking about what can we do to ensure that everybody enjoys soul freedom. And so the third point is just we need new ideas to implement. We have the structures in place that we need to continue to invest in and ensure that they're working properly, but the bad guys innovate, and we need to be innovating too. And we need to make sure that we value our values. It's good that we talk about them. It's good that we bring these values into our foreign policy, but we can't just stop at words. If we say human rights matter, then it really needs to matter. If we say religious freedom matters, then it really needs to matter. Otherwise, our statements become nothing more than arid euphemisms. In the book, I talk about sort of the four C's that we should pursue: consistency, coalitions, call-outs, and consequences. Consistency, make sure that we're talking about the importance of religious freedom with friend and foe alike. I have this interesting thought experiment in the book talking about a country in the Middle East that came to power, a regime that came to power through a religious revolution that fosters terrorism in other countries, that spreads hateful ideology around the world, that borders the Persian Gulf. And of course, you're probably thinking Iran, and that would be right. But it also would describe Saudi Arabia. And with one, we sanction and denounce, and the other one, our concerns are pretty muffled. Again, if we say this matters, it needs to matter with friend and foe alike, have that consistency. And then work in coalitions. I'm a multilateralist. I think while the United States is the indispensable actor, we can't do it all alone, and we shouldn't do it all alone. Religious freedom is a shared value with our European friends, with our friends in this hemisphere and Canada and South America, and we should work together in coalitions. And that actually can be more effective in a lot of situations because being a superpower, our relationships are complicated, and being savvy about who's the best carrier of that message, supported by American knowledge and resources, might be the best way, or maybe it's the United States needs to take the lead, but we need to be working in coalitions. And also thinking about coalitions, again, between religious communities, between civil society actors. And I talk about a three-legged advocacy stool. If any one of those legs is wobbly, if you don't have governments, if you don't have religious leaders, you don't have civil society actors, you're not going to be able to reach as high as you can or as you need to impact change. Third point, call-outs. Like I said, we need to make sure that the United States shines a light on abuses. We have the biggest megaphone in the world. We're blessed with the resources and influence that we have, and we need to use it because religious freedom matters, because it's in our interest and it reflects our values that religious freedom matters. And if a country doesn't like it, if Narendra Modi or Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping doesn't like what we're saying, they can change their policies. They actually have the answer to this problem, but we should not be shy about representing our beliefs and talking about our concerns. And then lastly, there need to be consequences. I talk about in the book the need for consequential diplomacy. It's important that we raise it. That's a starting point, and shining a light with small and medium countries can sometimes be enough to get someone out of jail, to start a reform process. But for the big players, it's not. And so how do we leverage all the influences that we've been blessed with to see oppressive systems change and space be open for religious freedom? It's hard work, and as someone who worked in these human rights spaces as a civil servant with politicians and political leaders from both parties, there's a sad bipartisan tradition of pulling our punches on these issues. I try to call balls and strikes in a fair way and highlight the good and also point out where we've fallen short. And this is an area where really no administration has been willing to put our full force and weight and influence on these issues when countries are unwilling to change. And I think, again, if we're serious about this, that needs to happen. And then lastly, continued effort is crucial. People need our help, to put it bluntly. Only the United States is strong enough to lead this. I know that when we're not there, other bad actors fill the void, the Chinese, the Russians, the Pakistanis. The burdens of leadership weigh heavy, but we've also been blessed with resources that we have the power to advocate for these rights. And like I said, it reflects our interests and our values. It reflects our values. Religious freedom is a core part of the American experience. The first settlers came here fleeing religious persecution in Europe. It's who we are as a country. We've never done it perfectly, but we've done it. I think we're working really hard to get it right in a way that many other countries aren't. And it reflects our interests. We know that when countries get this issue wrong, when they allow the persecution and victimization of people because of what they believe, it fosters instability, extremism, violence, human rights violations, and they just don't make effective partners for us. So this is why we need to carry this forward. And then lastly, this is stepping outside of the book. As Christians, we should care about this. I think we're called to pray and advocate for anyone who's facing persecution, both our brothers and sisters who suffer on the front lines of faith for following Christ, but also their non-Christian neighbors. I've seen time and time again that when Christians are persecuted, almost always someone else in their community of a different faith is also suffering for their beliefs. And I think we're called to be that voice for them. The previous speaker, talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and that's something I've always taken great encouragement and guidance from as I've done this work. And, I hate to make a biblical reference after an actual theologian. I'm just a lowly lawyer. But, the way the parable was set up in Luke 10 is in the context of, what does it take to inherit eternal life? So Jesus tells us this parable in that context of the ultimate question. And as Scott said, the lawyer, of course it was a lawyer who thought he could stump Jesus, asks him, what does it take to inherit eternal life? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, do this and you will live. And then the lawyer comes back with another gotcha question, he thinks. I'm reading into the text a little bit, and says, well, who's my neighbor? And that leads into the story of the Samaritan. Now, having a Samaritan as the star was a shocking development to first century ears, something I think we lose today. It's like, if you're Harry Potter fans, learning Snape is a good guy, or Darth Vader was Luke's dad, this is a kind of moment for the audience going, oh my gosh, because Samaritans were viewed as religiously and ethnically different than Jews, and they hated each other. You'll remember elsewhere in the Gospels, the disciples didn't even want to walk through Samaria. They wanted to go around it. And so for Christ to put the hero of the story as someone who crossed over religious lines of religion, ethnicity, hatred, and animosity, to go care for someone different than himself, to risk his own safety, maybe the robbers were still around, to give his time and his efforts, and then to say, go and do likewise, that's what we're called to do. And so I've been very fortunate to be able to do this work as a civil servant, advocating for people of all faiths and none, because it's in our interests and it reflects our values, but it also aligns with my values and how I think we as Christians are called to do this work. So with a lot of young people here, I will say the harvest is white and ready to be taken in, but the workers are few. We need the next generation to be interested in religious freedom advocacy. There's a hurting world, and they depend on people to stand up and speak out and to rally the forces of good to speak into this darkness. My program just sponsored a conference at Dallas Baptist University last week where we're trying to start a new approach for Christians to thinking about, yes, we're called to this work, to advocate for anyone who's suffering. We had a woman named Miriam Ibrahim, a Christian, who was held in prison in Sudan for 2 years because she wouldn't convert to Islam. She actually gave birth to her second child in her prison cell, but she talked about her commitment to Christ, and we talked about how this was something Christians prayed for, and I think too often we forget about our suffering brothers and sisters. But we also heard from a Uyghur Muslim advocate whose father has been sentenced to life in prison for just speaking up for his community. She hasn't seen him in a decade, and we had her share about her community. It was on her dad's birthday, and she literally was begging us to help them, that they have nowhere to run. And so that's the challenge before us. There aren't a lot of easy answers, but I know that if we are faithful to this, if we commit ourselves to prayer and advocacy, we can begin to make a difference. And I hope it's something that all of y'all will consider getting involved in. So thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions in the time we have left. Questions? Back there in the back.
Hello, my name is Kanan Fairley. I am a student at Abilene Christian. One of the points that you brought up was that there needs to be a little bit more consequential diplomacy, and how the past presidents have kind of failed or had a few deficiencies in that area. what do you expect from the next president as far as it goes for implementing a lot more consequential diplomacy? What actions do you want to see from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I hope whoever wins will enunciate a clear American commitment to advancing religious freedom for all. It's written into our law, and so that ensures that whoever wins, there will continue to be a special office at the State Department, special State Department reports, and that's good. But I would love to see either Mr. Trump or Ms. Harris talk about this as an American ideal, an American value. And if you want to partner with us, if you want to draw closer to us, then you need to get this issue right. I talk about in the book, the United States, despite all our power, or maybe because of all our power and resources, we're really bad at negotiating. And oftentimes we'd come into diplomatic engagements acting more like the supplicant than the superpower. And I think we need to just be really clear. If you want to draw close to us, you need to be good on these issues. So there's been a lot of attention given to India. It's the counterweight to China. It's the world's largest democracy. And this has been a sort of a bromance between Republican and Democratic administrations for Narendra Modi. But all the trend lines in India are going in the wrong direction. And yet we continue to almost beg them to be our friend, when actually it's China that's on their border, not our border. It's China that's been fighting with them over land and resources. And so I wrote about how we need to be really clear to a country like India. If you want to draw close to us, if you want to be under our security umbrella, if you want us to be pals when you've got this aggressive country on your border, there's some basics we need to get right, and you're failing on this one. And so I think there's a lot of ways. That's just leveraging sort of relational power, and then there's the power of sanctions. We've seen what's possible with Russia, but that sort of seems unique to Russia. We need to be more, frankly, aggressive after following diplomacy and giving them chances and encouraging them. And one thing I talk about in the book is also, it's hard to get a country like China or Russia to change its ways. But if we're firm on our values and we have these consequences, even if they don't work in those situations, other countries are paying attention. And so they will say, wow, if they're willing to do that to China, little old me, they do that to us, it'll destroy our economy or it'll ruin our ability to rule. And so that can, again, establish credibility, actually establish human rights deterrence if we're true to this. And I think this is where we can do a lot better.
Hi, Jules from Pepperdine University, but I'm interning with the Religious Freedom Institute. And so the U.S., we have so many different opportunities and different laws catering to religious freedom, and it's funded on that belief. But so many other countries, while they do have some of these laws, they're not aware of it. So us as a people, how are we supposed to have our Christian calling tells us to advocate for people? So how are we supposed to support other countries as well and advocate for those who aren't aware of this right?
As individual Christians or as a country talking to other countries?
As individual Christians,
Yeah.
but also in the sense of advocating for other countries.
We've established something called the Christians Against All Persecution Network, CAP Network, CAAP network.org, one word. And we've got resources, prayer guides, a Bible study to first equip you with knowledge. And I think that's where it starts. I mean, the Bible's very clear on this. In Proverbs, get wisdom, get knowledge. And then start to think about, well, what can you do in your immediate surroundings? Because, again, dealing with Uyghur persecution in China is really hard to do as an individual when you're in college. But I had this incredible experience when I was in Walmart returning something. And the lady at the cash register, she had her name and features led me to believe she was Uyghur. And so I said, "Are you a Uyghur Muslim?" And she was like, "Yes." And I said, "I know it's really hard there for your people. How is your family?" And she was so visibly moved that somebody knew enough to ask. So I do think there's something with the United States being the most diverse country on earth, with people from all over everywhere here. If you ask God to give you eyes, you will see people in your immediate surroundings who either have fled persecution, have family who are suffering, And just asking about it can be a cup of water on a cool day. I mean, these Afghans that are here, who we airlifted out, they have family back under Taliban rule. You have Jewish friends or Israeli friends who are so concerned about October 7th. You have Arab or Muslim friends who are concerned about Gaza. And I mean, these are just simple things you can ask, and that's just a easy first step to your neighbors, your physical neighbors. And then, we're incredibly blessed to live in America in the 21st century. And so you can go to your congressman, your senator, the presidential candidates, and say, what are you doing to advance religious freedom? There's a study that just came out that said if 10 people write their congressman, they can get a meeting. So, because that's like, gets it over the line for the congressman's attention. And I will guarantee you, as been in Washington a long time now, if elected representatives don't hear that this is a concern for their constituents, most aren't going to spend much time on it. There are a few that are driven by it out of experience or their own personal commitment, but a lot are just saying, there's 1,000,001 different issues that I'm hearing from my constituents. If I'm not hearing about this one, I don't have time for it. And so can you get the students at Pepperdine to write the congressperson who represents that area, or go back home where if you live somewhere else? These are very doable things. It just takes intentionality and commitment. Yes.
Hi, I'm Greg Moore. I work at Patrick Henry College, and I was thinking of the case of Pastor Wang Yi, a Chinese house church pastor who's been arrested for a few years now, and I think his name's been raised in diplomatic meetings between the U.S. and China, but I feel like it hasn't helped him. And I'm just wondering, is there a scorecard somewhere, or how well does it work for the State Department to take up a case of a specific person? I mean, what's the win-loss ratio?
Yeah.
Or how intense does it have to get before something moves?
It's a case-by-case situation. Early in my career, I worked on the country Uzbekistan, former Soviet Republic. We're jailing thousands of Muslims, lots of Christians, and we'd make these lists. And because they wanted to draw close to the United States, we give them a list, and people would get out of jail. So that was pretty low cost, just took time. China is on the other end of the spectrum. They're pretty immune. They don't appear to cave. But time and time again, I've heard from people who were in jail that when the United States raised concerns, their life in prison was a little bit better because the bad guys knew the good guys were onto them. And there is a sort of a rule that we like to talk about in human rights circles, do no harm. And so we'd always be very careful about, when the United States says something publicly, it carries far and wide. And will that make the situation better or worse? So the case of Asia Bibi, this woman in Pakistan, who I worked on this case for like 8 years. And we were very careful in that context to say sort of the minimum from a U.S. government mouthpiece, because we thought it would actually rile up the extremists in Pakistan. That would make it harder for the government to do the right thing. But then at the 11th hour, when she'd finally been pardoned for this trumped-up charge of blasphemy, she'd been let out of jail, but she was under house arrest. That's when I played a role in organizing this group of 10 like-minded countries, and we all delivered something called a démarche, which is a technical diplomatic term of when a government officially conveys the views of their leadership to say, let this woman out. And we'd already worked quietly with the Canadians to have a place where she could go and kind of disappear and restart her life with her family, and that worked. But it's a long, long slog. But I think we should continue to, in whatever level is deemed appropriate. I don't know this case, if it's private communications, public communications, civil society communications, raising names helps them at the end of the day. Any other questions? Yes.
Hello, I'm Mariah Barnell. I was wondering how can we do better about not allowing religious freedom to be equated with moral relativism? Because I think a lot of nations are concerned, like, for example, your Islamic nations are concerned that allowing religious freedom would lead to moral relativism in their nation, which would ultimately lead to the destruction of their culture. So how can we do better about not allowing certain groups to equate the two, and to say that moral relativism is the same as moral freedom or as religious freedom?
Yeah. I think the ultimate other, or if you look at the United States and our system and see what's polar opposite, you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, where it's one religion's established, one denomination of that religion is established, and if you're a citizen of that country, you have to be a member of that religion, with the exception if you're born into the Shia community. But you have to be a Wahhabi Sunni, and if you want to change, you will face execution. I've had conversations over the years with Saudi diplomats about, while I appreciate your commitment to your faith, as a person of faith, I appreciate that. In my experience, when faith is forced, it's brittle, it's shallow, and in the United States, we have this openness to faith, and it's rambunctious and always changing, but there's a vitality to it because people are choosing to be a member of the community. And so if the Saudi government is really wanting to have an authentic commitment to their faith, actually allowing people to choose to be in it or exit it would be the way to accomplish that goal. Because I think at the end of the day, it's environments where people are free to enjoy their God-given right of freedom of conscience. Of course, I wish everybody would join our community. I know some of my friends won't, and that's their right, and I'll still care for them, and they'll be want the best for them. But because if they choose to join, it's authentic, it's real, it's deep, it's alive, that's actually going to be better for the church than if something's forced or directed. Other questions? Home stretch. Yes, in the very back.
Hi, I'm Elena. I'm with the Institute of World Politics. This is kind of going back to the point about how we all inherently know we have freedom of religion. And you said, obviously, you want the next president to speak out against it. But do you think that the administrations aren't hard on the topic for other countries because they don't think people care about it? Or do you think people don't care about it because the administrations don't really go hard on it? And how do you think then to get people interested?
Yeah. I mean, one thing over the years, I've been try to be pragmatic. And of course, you talk about it as an American value, and this it's enshrined in our law that we should advocate it, but also understanding that every administration comes in with their priorities, and you need to present this issue in a framework or use a lexicon that they value. So, after 9/11, everything was countering violent extremism. So we would talk about how actually an environment that has religious freedom empowers those voices that can compete with the extremists who are pulling people towards violence. That's why we need to support religious freedom, for example. So, if I was back in government, if I was at the Religious Freedom Office at the State Department on day one of whoever wins, I'd be reading those speeches very closely, thinking about, okay, this is an area of interest. China, both candidates are going to be very tough on China. Well, that is, okay, you want to be tough on China? I can help you out. There's this group that is being victimized in addition to Tibetan Buddhists, in addition to the underground church. And here are some ideas for how we can be tough on China, if that's your goal. And it's still aligned with our values. So I think we have to be savvy. I also have a visiting fellowship at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and we did a study on how to ensure that international religious freedom promotion remains a bipartisan priority. I think we all know that domestically, religious liberty issues have taken on a partisan tone, which is unfortunate. So what do we need to do to protect the international work? Because at the end of the day, it's often issues of life and death. And strangely, that actually helps it because you know, thankfully, everyone's still against people being murdered for believing one thing or believing the wrong thing. But we did uncover that when talking with this working group we put together, people right, left, and center, all faiths and none, that the way you framed it mattered. So conservatives, if you talked about religious freedom, you know, yes, we're on that. But then we have to talk about religious freedom or beliefs of people not to believe, and we're advocating for everyone. Okay, we're good. With liberals or progressives, because of the domestic debate, they were like, But we talked about religious minorities and how they're being victimized for what they believe. They're like, yep, we're there, we're on. And we would meet at the same place. And I remember when I was at the State Department during the Trump administration, I oversaw, working with Sam Brownback, the big summits that the Trump administration did on international religious freedom. And Mr. Brownback had this great idea to bring in Nancy Pelosi to sit with Frank Wolf and talk about concerns about religious persecution in China. And it was such a moment of encouragement that here are these two people on vastly different sides of the political spectrum agreed that what was happening in China was wrong and that the United States had an important role to play because we're the United States to speak out against it. And so it's part of the work that I've been doing is to say, let's preserve this issue as one where right, left, and center agree it's something we need to pursue and avoid using it as a political sledgehammer when it helps your side, because it'll ultimately undermine the cause long term.